G'day folks, welcome back to the Man Cave, or an adjunct thereof, for this three-part vlog. You should not think you are the Ubermensch. A lot of people today think they are the Ubermensch, and I'm going to be suggesting very strongly that they should not think this. Couple of bits of housekeeping before we proceed into the three-part vlog, and this first part of the vlog, this first vlog, will cover the housekeeping. I'll take it as read in the later vlogs. Firstly, the vlog that I am doing is not a academic endeavour. I don't have any illusions that what I'm doing is somehow suitable to teaching undergraduate students or being published in free journals or anything like that. Now, you can make your own judgments about whether that means it's good or bad, and if you think that means it's bad, then off you go and do something else. But one thing that this vlog does allow me to do is to gauge not just what's happening in referee journals and in philosophy departments, but also to think about the effect that philosophical ideas are having, permeating through culture more broadly. And that's what I'm going to be looking at. And especially I'm going to be assuming that counterculture or subculture, the way I understand this, it doesn't need to be too tight, and we can think about that later, is a way in which the ideas of the Ubermensch have permeated through more general society and have had a larger historical effect. Okay, now one thing about this, which relates to the housekeeping issue, is that I'm interested in combining theory with practice, and the Man Cave, maybe not this exact part of it, but the Man Cave in general is a place where I not only theorise but tinker around with solar panels, repair push bikes, and basically combine theory with everyday life. And likewise, I'm not going to be using the visual element of a vlog too much. So that means you can go off and do the dishes and combine theory with everyday life in your own way, in your own manner. And if I do wind up using a visual element, I'll yell out. So the only reason I've really used the vlog format at all is because people like to put a face to the words, and it's hard to beat a moving face. Okay, great. So in this first vlog, I'm going to be asking, well, what is the concept of the Ubermensch that everyone thinks that they are it, and I'll be suggesting in the third vlog are not. And in the second vlog, I'll be looking at how it has diffused through, the concept of the Ubermensch has diffused through culture more broadly, outside of philosophy departments and so on. I'm not saying it comes from them, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but it's certainly gone beyond the confines of the ivy-covered towers. And in the third, I'll be suggesting why you shouldn't think you are the Ubermensch, though you probably do, because every bugger does. So let's proceed along those lines in that structure. Okay, so one thing that I want to be looking at and talking about is the idea of the Ubermensch as a position on truth. Now, this isn't completely usual in terms of how the concept's treated, either within or without academia. But it's not completely unusual either, and down below I'll link a book which was influential on me in thinking about the concept of the Ubermensch along these lines, and is an academically, well, it was once an academically respectable tome. So you can read up more about it yourself if you so desire, in respect of thinking about it as a concept of truth. I guess one reason why I want to do this as well is because there are different ways of approaching the notion of the Ubermensch, and some assume a certain idea of truth, that truth is objective in some sense, which is something I will be arguing for, and others that truth is, that the idea of the Ubermensch is right. And by actually focusing to begin with on the notion of truth, I hope to not beg the question either way, but try and make some arguments. And I hope to not fall into styles of philosophy that assume truth is along the lines of what I'll be talking of as an Aristotelian idea of truth, nor along the lines of Nietzsche, but trying to look at some idea of truth as something we can examine. There are problems with this, and I'll towards the end of this first vlog, I'll look at problems with this, and it does seem like a bit weird to ask what is truth. Pontius Pilate apparently asked it. David Bowie does a good version of the Pontius Pilate asking of it, but okay, moving right along. So I mentioned the name Nietzsche in respect of the Ubermensch, and that's where the idea of the Ubermensch comes from. It's a philosophical idea that was invented in the later 19th century by Friedrich Nietzsche. When I say invented, kind of a strange way to describe what was a sort of an evolution, but we can check that out in due course. Okay, so let's turn to the idea of truth. Now, the idea of truth that I'm going to be looking at, I've already suggested is an Aristotelian one. And you might think, well, you know, that's sort of just one idea of truth. Why start with that? Why juxtapose that to the idea of the Ubermensch, even if we can show that the idea of the Ubermensch is a position on truth? And the answer I'd give to that question is that I'd say that a certain notion of objectivity, which we will have to, of course, properly explore and cash out, is actually, in some senses, a fairly traditional notion of truth. Now, I'm going to be looking at how it arises in ancient Greek thinking, and therefore influences sort of European thought coming out of Europe and England and eventually the United States. So to do with, to some extent, an Anglophonic approach to philosophy. Although when we're talking about Europe, of course, we're also talking about a different tradition, which I've suggested exists, which is a more continental, less Anglophonic tradition. But I don't want to get too caught up in that. What I would suggest is that the idea of truth that I'll present as traditional is quite... It's certainly very universal in a European context, and that the later reaction by Nietzsche and others, we'll be looking at that a bit, is exactly that, a reaction. But also this idea of truth may have drawn something from further afield. There may have been influences from Egypt, from Asia, and to this day, Chinese philosophy, for instance, thinks of truth in a way I'll present as traditional. And actually, it's Australian enough. I went to a seminar years ago where some Australian Indigenous philosophers argued that the same thing applied there. But the way that that's Chinese philosophy and Indigenous philosophy is supposed to handle truth is sometimes unorthodox compared to the tradition I'll present. So let's start in ancient Greece. And from there we can go on to look at the idea of the Ubermensch as a notion of truth. We can look at the notion of truth itself to some extent, which we must do. Okay, so around about the 6th century BC, around about 600 BC, in a place called Ionia, people started moving away from a mythical perspective. Now, again, we've got to be careful how we characterise this. And in fact, how we characterise this is very important here. One way to characterise this is that a mythical perspective was about often anthropomorphised or animalised nature. And it did so as part of a life way whereby people could survive in quite extreme environments. They didn't have computers and cars and guns, so they survived as they could. And in some ways, myth can be understood functionally as assisting this. So, for instance, myths often, say for instance, Australian Indigenous myths, without wanting to homogenise myth globally too much, but Australian Indigenous myths, for instance, contain information about food sources and water sources and so on, or some do. Let's not even homogenise overall Australian Indigenous myths, but the idea that I'm trying to forward here is one of a kind of a functional analysis of myth, where it's useful and you survive by thinking about your own needs and desires and thinking about nature in those terms. Now, there have been arguments made against this kind of functional analysis of myth, that myth's too bizarre to really be like this. I don't find those. Claude Levi-Strauss, for instance, makes arguments along those lines. I don't really find those arguments very convincing. And one reason why not is that I don't see any reason why quite bizarre beliefs can't be useful. I mean, quantum physics is quite bizarre, but it seems pretty useful in terms of how we understand the fundamentals of matter today. And also, I mean, a certain belief might be quite bizarre in a web of belief, but it might be anchored in a more empirical manner that's maybe less bizarre. So I think there's something to be said for a functional analysis of myth. The idea, I think, with myth isn't necessarily to dominate nature. So if we're going to start with the Ionic thinkers, 600 BC, like it wasn't until 2,000 years later, really, that ideas of, at least in the Western tradition, ideas of domination of nature were articulated by Francis Bacon in the 1500s. So what I'm trying to say here is that myth is a form of a way of surviving. And for some reason or another, and I don't really want to go into why. I mean, there are questions about why. That this method of survival and of of social interest, self-interest, was challenged, at least in the sense that an alternative was presented around about 600 BC in Ionia. And the idea here of this alternative was that we try and figure out, without anthropomorphization or animalization or without concern so much for our desires, what's out there. Maybe there was an interested aspect of this, I'm sure there was, that this could maybe ameliorate the effects of quite extreme climate that we found in Ionia, quite extreme seasonal variation, not the most extreme seasonal variation in the world, but certainly sort of more extreme variation than, for instance, Indigenous people who are using myth here in Brisbane might have experienced prior to the invasion of whites. So what we're looking at here is an idea that that we can approach the world around us without concern for our desires. We ask, irrespective of our desires, what is the world around us like? And I think this is one way to understand what the early Ionic philosophers, people like Thales and moving into maybe 500 BC, it's Heraclitus, did. So the idea of truth that comes out of this is this idea of setting aside your own desires and asking, well, what is out there? What is nature? And that's what Heraclitus's book was apparently called, On Nature. So this idea is an idea about objectivity in that sense. I don't want to go too far into objectivity, but objectivity in that sense. And the point here is that it's not that we can't examine our desires. I mean, I think that what comes pretty rapidly out of this idea is that we can look at our desires, but if we want to be truthful about them, they're irrespective about what our desires about those desires might be. There was a series of thinkers who perpetuated this tradition, or took this tradition up, took up the torch of this idea of truth. Parmenides after Heraclitus, Plato later on. And I think the ancient Greek thinker who most clearly encapsulates this idea of truth is in fact Aristotle. And somewhere in the Metaphysics, Aristotle says, if you say of what is that it is, and you say of what is not that it is not, then you speak the truth. Look, like I say, I'm not trying to be completely academically perfect here, so I don't know if it's a verbatim quote, but certainly that's the gist of what Aristotle says somewhere in the Metaphysics, maybe book 3 or 4. It's been a while since I've read it. So, and I read it in translation. Sorry. So, what we've got here is this idea of the truth as something irrespective of desire, and this plays into ideas like logic, right? One way to understand logic is as a way of preserving truth through a series of inferential moves. And so whatever you desire to be the truth is irrelevant in logic. It's that if such and such a proposition is true and it obeys the right rules, then another proposition is true, a conclusion is true, irrespective of what you desire. Now, this idea of truth as being outside of the wishes of human beings, and in that sense subjective. I don't want to go too far into this idea of objectivity, but let's be content with that for the moment. This idea winds up being very influential for a long time. I've already mentioned how I think that it's geographically influential. But even if we focus on the kind of Western tradition, which is where I am by far the most comfortable, we find that it's not really questioned through a number of centuries. So we get to the era of the church, of feudalism in Europe. Let's just stay there for a moment. I'm not saying it's a be-all and end-all, but let's just stay there. And we find that the idea of truth is objective in this sense. It plays into religion. So God's there, whether we desire God or not. God's will's there, whatever our desires about God's will. You know, God's outside of us, like God's up there. And so God presents a very strong idea of this objectivity. We find this in medieval philosophy. And this was tied into Aristotle by medieval philosophy. So the interpretation of Aristotle was that that even though Aristotle was part of a polytheistic society, of ancient Greek society, which is polytheistic, that in fact Aristotle held to a notion of truth that was compatible with the idea that whether we like it or not, here's God's will. That Aristotle was not secretly, but certainly should be understood as monotheist in a way that was important to the church in the Middle Ages. And then after that we get a reaction against the church in the Enlightenment, the European Enlightenment I'm just talking about here. Okay, and still this idea that what's going on and what's important is objectivity. Only now we start shifting this to sense data rather than the revealed word of God. One reason why I'm interested in the European tradition here, and it is important globally, it's not the only important tradition, but it's important, is also that this is where Nietzsche comes out of and what Nietzsche reacts to. So I guess by the time we hit the 19th century, which is Nietzsche's century, and the century where the idea of the Ubermensch, which I'm presenting as an idea of truth, is developed, I guess there's a bit of cause for dismay. I mean, truth was supposed to give us a better world in the Middle Ages, the world according to God. Okay, we're fallen beings, but it was supposed to be good. And in fact, as the Middle Ages ran into the Enlightenment, it became clear that, or certain people made clear the idea that this was the best of all possible worlds, that God gave us Leibniz, for instance, did this, that God gave us a really, a good world, and that that truth, in this sense, was about the divine will, irrespective of us. And then it becomes about, in the Enlightenment, we get this shift more towards an idea of science making the world a better place. Maybe it's not the best of all possible worlds, but science makes the world a better place. And you can see this shift in Voltaire, Candide, and Zadig, the famous satires. But so we don't have to assume that the world's a better place. We can assume it's pretty grim, but that science maybe can make the world, and reason can maybe make the world a better place. And so that in terms of thinking about the truth as important and as about being objective, we pass from a kind of a religious view to a sort of scientific worldview, but we've still got the same idea of truth, and it's irrelevant of our desires, that we can look at the way the world is instead of the way the world is as decreed by God, but in either case, that is irrelevant of our desires. However, the problem is not a lot comes out of this, right? Like, I mean, by the time we hit the 19th century, especially the later 19th century, where, well, Nietzsche's starting to... We can think more about Nietzsche's actual biography, but he's starting to exert an influence in the later 19th century. They sometimes talk about a mal du siècle, a sickness at the end of the century. And what it refers to is the idea that, like, people are kind of like thinking, well, where's all this truth taken us? Well, this is one aspect of it anyway. Where's all this truth taken us? And the answer is that the truth, as given to us by religion, was deemed to be oppressive and inadequate and restrictive. But then what did the Enlightenment gave us? It gave us science, and it gave us the exploration of the world and genocide and environmental destruction. Already by the 19th century, the Romantics had started to point out environmental destruction. Keats is a brilliant example of this. If we're talking in European terms, and then we can think about how people are becoming aware of how the exploration of the Wild West or Australia or whatever was genocidal, and there wasn't a lot to show for it. Back at home in Europe, if you want to think along those terms, then we had sort of like books like Friedrich Engels, The Condition of the Working Class in England in 1844 or 5. And it was pretty clear, lays the groundwork for Marx's work, that things were pretty grim, both at home and abroad. And so what did this idea of truth really gotten us? Okay, so there were some attempts to question truth critically, but they didn't really go the whole way to the concept of the Ubermensch to Nietzsche that we're going to look at. And I'm just going to flag one. This will become important later in vlog 3. But I'm just going to flag one. And one is the idea of utilitarianism. Okay, now utilitarianism is quite interesting because it starts bringing back in our desires, right? So the idea of utilitarianism is we assess everything in terms of how happy it makes us, and we have a quantificational. We quantify happiness, and then we balance different options, and the option which has the greatest amount of happiness is the option we take. Now, you can see here that desire, in terms of happiness, which is quite a loose term but it's a term for desire, yeah, is paramount. But on the other hand, there's an absolute truth about this, irrelevant of our desires. So, in a sense, the truth hasn't been, the idea of truth, the Aristotelian idea of truth, hasn't really been questioned. I say Aristotelian even though I have actually pointed out that there was earlier precedents, but that's how I'm using the term. Now, what are we going to say about that? I think one thing we're going to say about that is that I think that utilitarianism shows that there's a dissatisfaction with the way that the world's being run. And by the 19th century, utilitarianism, which was promulgated by a guy called Bentham, as we get into the 19th century, it's very diffuse and very much out there, and it's like the idea of the Ubermensch as well. You know, it's ideas of truth which actually wind up diffuse through culture. Now, when Nietzsche comes along, we want to say about that is that none of this seems to have gone far enough. And what Nietzsche does is he makes a very radical move, which I'm going to be arguing against. Okay, so maybe I've kind of revealed here why I think you should not think you're the Ubermensch. It's not really anything about you, it's actually about the concept of the Ubermensch. There you go. But anyway, that Nietzsche brings back in desire in a sense that we all have to explore, because desire is, of course, a kind of a strange concept too, or a hard to define concept. He brings it back in. Now, of course, it's not enough to say that, like, oh, look, Aristotle was wrong. That the way in which we look at the world, what is truth, is not about. It's not irrespective of our desires. In fact, it involves our desires. Okay. So Nietzsche is obviously going to need more than that. He's also going to need to talk about. He's also going to need to offer a package, yeah, where this kind of makes sense. Where previously what we've had is this idea of truth as unconcerned with desire, that powered, for instance, feudal Europe, or powered, for instance, a more scientific view involving sense data or sense experience. Empowered logic as a way to not be concerned about desire, and logic equally comes to play a part in this kind of scientific worldview. So one thing that Nietzsche brings up, I think, and it's very important, is the idea of bad faith. So, okay, to get to that. The Ubermensch that Nietzsche talks about is the Ubermensch of instead of bowing to the truth, as, for instance, Socrates had done, and dying for the truth, as Socrates had done, and Nietzsche mocks Socrates for that. That what we say and do is that we have an idea of the truth where we assert it, like the Ubermensch asserts it. Ubermensch asserts it to, in fact, assert themselves over other persons. Their desires, their life projects become what's important. And the Ubermensch is a kind of an eagle asserting themselves over the lambs, the Untermensch, or those who aren't the Ubermensch. And the Ubermensch asserts themselves in this way. And in so doing, declares what is true. Right? That's what's important here. In so doing, declares what is true. Now, this is very different to the Aristotelian version, and obviously incompatible with it. So, what does Nietzsche offer against this way of thinking which is driven in Europe, scholastic philosophy and the Enlightenment? And one thing he offers is the idea of bad faith. He offers more than that. Like, Nietzsche offers a whole aesthetic. You know, you should think of art in terms of art, which is about asserting yourself. You know, maybe you could read de Sade like that. I don't know, but whatever. You know, art which is about like asserting yourself. And doing so, you know, flagrantly and taking your assertions as truth. So Nietzsche offers that. Now, that total package involves this idea of bad faith. And the idea of bad faith is very important to the total package on account of the fact that the avoidance of bad faith is a reason to accept the package. I mean, if we're talking about sort of like aesthetic preferences, well, you know, they come along for the ride with the package and maybe make it more attractive and pretty it up. But the idea of bad faith is an actual reason you should accept, as proposed by Nietzsche, as a reason you should accept the Ubermensch view of truth as something you assert for your own ends over others, instead of, say, for instance, the Aristotelian version of truth. And the way this works is that what happens is that you look at the truth, and if you don't assert yourself on the basis of declaring what is true, then you're in this position where you're denying what's real about truth. You're in a position where you're saying, look, I don't assert myself for this further truth that's out there, whether it be God or science or whatever it be. That's why I don't assert myself. And that's a lie, because according to Nietzsche, everyone wants to and should assert themselves over others. And when you fail to assert yourself and you don't face that failure, you're guilty of bad faith. And you make excuses. You say, oh, look, it's because of morality. Oh, look, it's because of science. It's because of God. Right? So you haven't actually taken yourself in hand, and you haven't been true to yourself. And that's the essence of bad faith. Okay, so that's a reason we should believe in the Ubermensch, because we want to avoid that kind of bad faith. And we're believing there in a notion of truth. I was going to say before when I was talking about the housekeeping, that because I'm not really using the visual aspects of a vlog, if you're away out doing sort of like the dishes or something, then you don't really need to, I mean, you could go off and do the dishes, you don't really need to be watching me here. Like I'm not really contributing much to this vlog. It's more about my voice and my image. However, if you are doing that, and I totally approve of that, because that fits in with the idea of the man cave, you know, of combining theory with everyday life and practical concerns. However, if you are doing that and you've gone off and done the dishes or something else, come back for a minute, because we've got a visual element to this vlog. It's this word, alethic. And that means to do with the truth. The study of truth, you could also say, is alethiology, but I think that's doing way too much violence to everyday speech. So what we're talking about with the Ubermensch is an alethic concept. And the visual component here is the spelling of the word alethic, which is quite an unusual word, and which is why I balk at maybe going further and using words like alethiology, study of truth. So let's discount that, strike that off from the record. Okay, so what's happening with Nietzsche then is that Nietzsche's saying, look, here's how we should see truth. We shouldn't see truth in the way that Aristotle's seen truth. We should see truth in terms of desire, but in terms of desire in terms of a view of truth as dependent upon desire, motivated by the need to avoid bad faith. I've been motivated by the desire to avoid bad faith. That would be consistent, if a little bit circular, but it's a package that's being offered here. and that's what's important. Now, this view of truth that Nietzsche's offering is a view which then goes on to include, say, for instance, aesthetic. So Nietzsche celebrates, for instance, or at least distinguishes between Dionysian and Bacchanalian art, and has a celebration of this kind of Bacchanalian assertion of power. And what we want to say about this package at the moment is that it offers a radical departure from the Aristotelian view of truth, as where desire is irrelevant. Okay, so with this idea of bad faith and of truth as an assertion of someone's desire of to be who they want to be, to maximise themselves, to fulfil their own destinies, and to do what they want effectively. You might think, well, okay, that's very interesting, but how does this relate to a notion of truth that's able to, a radical idea of truth that's able to permeate through culture, as I will be going on to suggest in the later vlogs. And I'm glad you asked that. Now, the main thing here is the question about who can be the Ubermensch, who can adopt this idea of truth. And that question is a very contested question. But before we get onto it, I want to say one thing about it being a contested question. And that is that it's kind of weird that we might think that a view about truth, a view about the Ubermensch as an alethic concept, is in any way restricted. And what I mean by that is this. The way philosophy works is that if you can accept the arguments for a particular philosophical thesis, then you're rightfully the holder of that thesis. So imagine, what's a good example? Imagine, right, that you wind up saying that you believe that what Karl Popper says about what's important in science and what's important as a way of solving the problem of induction. I'm not going to go too far into this, but that what's important in science is that a thesis be falsifiable and be falsified. Okay. So if you accept that, okay, then you are a falsificationist, providing you understand Popper's arguments that falsifying instances are what are important in science. And the same thing seems to be true of the Ubermensch, right? Like, if you can accept Nietzsche's critique using his idea of bad faith, that Aristotle is wrong, then it looks like you accept the idea of the Ubermensch as an alethic concept, and, well, I mean, just the Ubermensch thing. So, in this perspective, anyone can be the Ubermensch, yeah? So, you could be in New Delhi and you've read Nietzsche or a Hindu translation of Nietzsche. I am the Ubermensch. Yep, you are. You could be a gay woman in... Actually, my background, my ethnic background is actually Irish, but I'm not very good at the brogue. I'm better at the lilt. Well, it's a bad parody of the lilt that I'm at the brogue, but, you could be a gay woman, say, Dublin. Yeah, I'm the Ubermensch. It would sound like an knocker, like I sound like, but you get the idea. So it doesn't seem like there's any kind of like reason why only some people can be the Ubermensch. Anyone who understands the arguments, who understands that Nietzsche wants to reject Aristotle, and that a major argument for him doing so is this idea of bad faith. It could be the Ubermensch. Now, this got very confused, right? And one way it got confused is actually, you can see with the idea of Ubermensch itself, right? Look, I barely speak the Queen's English, but in German, that's a gendered noun, Ubermensch, right? Refers to men. Now, actually, this was something that, and it's very important for what I'm going to say. This is something that was taken up, especially in the 90s. Now, I've said at the beginning when I was doing the housekeeping that actually what's important here is about the diffusion of these philosophical concepts throughout popular culture. And this was one thing that was certainly taken up in a manner which was diffused through popular culture. It was about the genderedness of the Ubermensch. So Nietzsche believes that women can't be the Ubermensch because he believes that due to their kind of social role, women are always stuck with bad faith rather than being doers. They're sort of parasiting off men, basically. But, like, this already presupposes that we accept these kind of gender roles, right? So as a lot of people started pointing out around me, and I'm not going to quote chapter and verse, and I'm not going to quote referee journal articles. It was something that was out there in the arts. I mean, I grew up in the ANU, the Australian National University, and, you had a bar which was full of punks generally, I was one of them. And then you had the kind of an art school, and you had sort of like academics, and they all mixed. And this idea that women could be an Ubermensch as well, that they could decide what was true as part of their assertive endeavours, was something that was quite important in the 90s, and a lot of women took up. No, not just women, but a lot of women took up. And so the Ubermensch is also the Uberwench, which was a term that was very popular then in art scenes. It begins with art. It's something we can get onto in the later vlogs, but it certainly seemed to begin with art, this diffusion of this concept. And, art's a way of dealing with these kind of unusual concepts, I guess, in our society, because it's a way of being creative outside everyday life. If you want to use a kind of formalist idea of art, I don't believe in formalist ideas of art, but certainly it gives you an indicator of how it might work. Now, I mean, this idea that the Ubermensch was more restricted than, say, being a falsificationist, went back further than that, and was to do with the way Nietzsche wrote. Like Nietzsche didn't like, this is one of the weird things about the Ubermensch, he got associated with the Nazis later on. And Nietzsche didn't like himself, he didn't like, it's difficult to say here, but he certainly had reservations about nationalism and anti-Semitism, white nationalism and anti-Semitism. And the reservations he had come out of this idea of bad faith. So if I want to assert myself against a Jewish person or a person of a different race, and I use the fact that they're Jewish or that they're a person of a different race, then I'm guilty of bad faith, because bad faith is when you don't just, when you can't face the fact that you need to assert yourself and you need to declare what's true. If you use an excuse that someone's a Jew or that someone's different race, whatever, then you're guilty of bad faith. So actually Nietzsche didn't like this stuff, but it got taken up by the Nazis. Nietzsche got taken up by the Nazis quite famously on the basis of basically his sister. This is a terrible philosophical argument, right? You know, like what someone's sister says. Someone's sister saying that, like, Nietzsche did endorse white anti-Semitic nationalism. So, again, we get this idea that there's only some people can be the Ubermensch. You know, I don't know, white nationalists, perhaps, non-Jews. But again, as with the Ubermensch, it just doesn't stand any kind of critical analysis, right? Like, I mean, the problem here is that if you want to say it's only, you know, white nationalists or anti-Semites, then you fall into this bad faith. It's a little bit more complicated than that, and I'll get to that. But at least as we begin to unpack the idea of the Ubermensch as a notion of truth, it becomes clear that it's a fairly open concept, as I originally suggested with the New Delhi and the Dublin examples. It's a fairly open concept. Okay, so this openness of this concept's happening. Now, Nietzsche himself wasn't completely happy with it being an open concept. He thought there was a kind of a lived aspect to it. And so if you're reading Nietzsche, there's a lot of stuff in Nietzsche about how, you know, he's not an armchair philosopher. And, okay, fine. But it's not really about a physical, as it's been pointed out a lot, it's not really about a physical prowess. It's more about desire, avoiding bad faith again. And even if there was a kind of some sort of physical qualification for being an Ubermensch, it looks like it, you know, it's you know, anyone who can sort of stand up for themselves and, you know, I mean, it really looks like it really does look like it's anyone. Nietzsche himself perhaps contributed to the confusion. He wrote about the blonde beast of the Ubermensch going down into the sort of flocks, the sheep. But what Nietzsche was talking about there was that, like, and this will become important, was that, like, when you assert yourself, you don't just do so as some kind of Cartesian soul, but you do so as some sort of historically instantiated personality, yeah. And for Nietzsche, you know, that was how he identified with it. But again, we must remember that as much as he talks about this kind of blonde beast stuff, he's not interested in how Hitler and his sister took up his ideas. And that was a real commonplace too, by the way, in the 90s. Again, getting back to this idea of diffusion through popular culture. The idea even then was that people could anyone could be the Ubermensch, the Uberwench, whatever. We should accept that it's a fairly open concept, and that began to be considered in this sort of, I'm going to reference again, artistic milieus and so on. Nietzsche does himself sometimes talk about some funny stuff in respect of Jewish people. But it's quite enlightening to actually analyse this and see what it means. And here's what I mean. Okay, so I don't know, like the Old Testament Jews killed the Hittites, for instance. Like, you know, as Richard Dawkins has pointed out and many other people, look, you know, the Old Testament's a pretty pretty bloody book, pretty violent. You know, the Jews are slaying their enemies all the time. Now, Nietzsche brings this up, but it's important to realise here what's going on. Nietzsche's not against the Jews, you know, asserting themselves over, say, the Hittites, right? On the contrary, right? That's like the Ubermensch, yeah? They're asserting themselves. They're declaring what's true and they're just doing it. And they're asserting themselves as eagles over the sheep. But there's a problem, right? That the Old Testament Jews bring in Yahweh to justify themselves. And just as it's bad faith to bring in white nationalism, bad faith to bring in anti-Semitism, so Nietzsche's problem with the Old Testament Jews is that they didn't just own what they were doing. They didn't just say, yep, we're asserting ourselves over the Hittites. They said, oh no, we're doing it because Yahweh is good and Yahweh told us to. So they're not able to be the Ubermensch because they're not actually just straight out asserting themselves. Maybe modern Zionists are closer to Nietzsche's idea of the Ubermensch. I don't want to go there. But yeah, I'll just throw that out there. Okay, so what we've got, and I'm going to wind up this part one of this vlog here, is an idea of a fairly open concept, Maybe there's reservations here. We can go into them a bit in the second and third vlog, but we're looking at a pretty open concept. Anyone can be the Ubermensch. And that's why I said to you, I kind of tricked you with this the way I'd phrase this vlog. When I say you should not think of yourself as the Ubermensch, it's not because only some people can be the Ubermensch. It's because of problems with the concept of the Ubermensch itself.